Hello, friends. Welcome to Suman versus Human. This is episode 44, and on this episode, I have a super interesting guest that is Peter Torpy. Peter is a scientist, a musician, and he owns a very popular international podcast called Eyes on Success. Peter's journey is super interesting, and let's know more about Peter in a while. Welcome to Suman versus Human. Peter, I'm so excited to have you on my show.
It is exciting to talk to you in person, Suman, from across the world.
Peter, you are from America. I'm very curious about how could a blind person become a scientist? Scientist that too in an organization which is specialized in imaging.
It is kind of
Xerox.
a funny story.
Yeah.
It is kind of a funny story. So I was, in some sense, I consider myself kind of fortunate to have been born blind. I had partial vision when I was a young child,
Hmm.
and I could see by holding a book a couple of inches from my nose until I started graduate school.
Hmm.
So I was plugged into a lot of the resources for blindness. I was aware of making accommodations.
Hmm.
And I got a large part of my education done while I could still see, even though sometimes it was a struggle.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I had an operation that left me totally blind the summer before I was supposed to start graduate school.
Hmm.
And that summer is when I finally learned to use a cane. I relearned my braille skills that I had learned as a child when I went to
Hmm.
a school for the blind. And I said, I'm just going to make the changes I need to make to go on to graduate school.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, my colleagues in graduate school would read my textbooks to me on tape.
Hmm.
And so I got along that way for a while. And then my vision cleared up. So I was able to use a closed circuit TV system, a CCTV, by blowing up the print a few inches high, white on black with lots of contrast.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
was still difficult for me to take tests and read things, but with persistence and a little extra work, it worked out okay.
How about getting into scientist? Like, how did you become a scientist? Being a blind person.
Well, when I was a kid, I always enjoyed mathematics, and I was always working on mathematical games and puzzles and things like that. I always enjoyed science. I read lots of science books. So it was sort of ingrained in me. And, I didn't know what to do when I went to college. I figured there are many things you could major in. You could major in some kind of science like electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, whatever, but I didn't know which one.
Hmm.
But I figured if I majored in physics, that sort of encompassed everything because physicists study electromagnetism, they study mechanics, they study optics. And so I figured I could make a choice at another time. So I just had fun being a physicist.
Hmm.
I tried occasionally to transfer to the math department because I enjoyed mathematics. But every time I'd talk to some of the math professors there and say, okay, if I got a degree in mathematics, what could I do with that? They'd
Hmm.
say, well, you could teach. And I'd say, well, what else could you do though? And they said, well, you could teach. So I stayed being a physics major. And then after you get a bachelor's in physics, you realize that with a bachelor's in physics, there's not much you can do. You really need an advanced degree. So it
Hmm.
was pretty clear that I needed to go to graduate school in order to, get a higher degree in order to get a job that was rewarding and fun. So that's how I wound up in graduate school in physics.
But don't you think dealing with mathematics and physics is really challenging task for a blind person because mathematics involves a lot of math and formula stuff like that which needs eyesight to solve them.
I mean, so that's interesting you should say that. When my wife Nancy says to people that I sort of lost my vision as the technology improved. So, for example, when I was still able to use my closed circuit TV system by looking at text that was several inches big with lots of contrast. They didn't have refreshable braille displays, and
Mm,
so I couldn't use technologies like that. But as my sight decreased and over the years I was no longer able to use closed circuit TVs, all of a sudden there were speech synthesizers, braille displays, and I was able to modify from using my eyeballs to using my fingers to interact with braille.
So once you are graduate, once you're out of the schools and college, while you were searching for a job, so did you ever feel any kind of difficulty getting into employment?
I was very fortunate. That was a very smooth process for me. When I was looking for a job, it was in 1979 is when I got my PhD from graduate school.
Hmm.
And looking for a job back then was a very different process. I mean, these days it's all done on the internet and LinkedIn
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
making connections with other people. I didn't have any of that.
Hmm.
I basically wrote up a bunch of paper letters, put them in envelopes with stamps,
Hmm.
and sent them to companies that I thought might be hiring physicists.
Hmm.
And I stuck my resume in there. And I never indicated to people on my resume or any of the paperwork that I was blind.
Hmm.
I just basically sent my resume with my credentials, my background, and what I was interested in doing.
Hmm.
And, from that, I got a number of job interviews. And the first they would know when I'd fly to an interview, they'd say, "Okay, how do I find you at the airport?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm the guy with the white cane." They said, "What do you
Ah.
mean the white cane?" I said, "Well, I'm blind."
Hmm.
And interestingly, after I got my job at Xerox and took that job, about a year later, I asked my manager, I told him about not disclosing that I was blind.
Hmm.
And did he have any concerns about hiring a blind person once I showed up with a cane? And he said, "Well, I figured if you got through graduate school and got a PhD being blind, you had that under control. And we were just interested in your credentials and what
Hmm.
you could do for us." So I
Wow.
was very fortunate. They were very supportive at Xerox, my managers, my colleagues, and it was a very friendly place to work.
So your very first job started from Xerox, right?
Yes, yeah,
And you continued all the way long. Throughout your career, you were in Xerox, right?
I was. So interestingly, when I was going through graduate school, my intent was I was always interested in applied physics. I
Hmm.
figured if you have all this knowledge, I could split atoms apart and study very esoteric things, but I wanted to have a practical impact on the world. And
Hmm.
my
Hmm.
intent was to get my PhD and then teach at a university so I could tell upcoming students this is why you're learning physics. This
Hmm.
is what you can do when you go out in the world and make an impact. And so my thought was in order to do that, I had to have some experience in industry before going back to university because many college professors, they've never been in industry before. They can't tell you what that experience is like, what
Yeah.
kind of jobs there are in industry. So that was my initial plan, but I enjoyed Xerox so much that I just never left. It was a lot of fun. I
Excellent.
tell
And
people,
I'm
as I
sure
mentioned,
your contribution was incredible in Xerox.
well, I think it was. I had a good time there, and I think I made some major contributions to the way they developed the inkjet printers that I was working on and all. And I tell people, as I mentioned to you early in the interview, I used to play a lot of mathematical games and puzzles when I was a kid. Well, at Xerox, they paid me to do that. So it almost wasn't work. It was just a lot of fun. And I worked with bright, motivated, intelligent people. It was great.
Xerox also gave you your life partner.
That was interesting. Yeah. So I started working at Xerox in 1979.
Hmm.
And in 1982, Nancy, my wife now, had just finished a postdoc in physics in Germany.
Hmm.
And she was coming back to this country and she had a job offer from Xerox. So she
Hmm.
started working in August of 1982. It turns out that I was living in an area where sort of the young professionals lived, and
Mm,
she wound up with an apartment there too, just several blocks from me. So
mm,
we wound up in the same carpool. It turns out our bosses both work for the same person, so we were pretty close at Xerox organizationally.
mm,
But the real way we met was in graduate school. We had each picked up doing what they call contra dancing. It's sort of like square dancing, but in straight lines in this country. And
mm.
so when we each came to Rochester, we looked up the local contra dance crowd. And so we immediately met dancing. So one way or another, we were going to meet. So we met in August when she joined Xerox, and we were friends and probably had a first date in January, and we were actually married the next June.
Oh,
It was pretty quick, and now we've been married for almost 42 years.
yeah. Nancy is sighted, right? Your wife is sighted.
She is, yes, yeah.
Tell me, what was a work you were doing in Xerox, Pete?
So when I was in graduate school, I really wanted to be an experimentalist, to work in the lab.
Mm,
And after working in the lab for about a year or so prior to working on my dissertation, my advisor called me in and he said, Pete, are you sure you want to be an experimentalist? And I said, yeah, that's what I want to do. He says, well, look, I know you're bright and you're hardworking, and I think you can do whatever you want. I'll support you whatever you want. Just realize it may take you a little bit longer because,
mm,
it's difficult for a blind person to work in the lab, even if you're
mm,
working with other people. And I thought about that. And, really, I'm kind of a pragmatist. My attitude is there are many ways to enjoy yourself. I don't
mm.
need to be an experimentalist to do fun physics. I could do some more theoretical work. And so I thought about it for a bit and I said, I don't want to spend my life in graduate school. I want to get out and start doing things. So I became a theoretician. I started doing computer modeling. And that's how I started out. That was that's how I started my research in graduate school.
Mm,
And when I came to Xerox, I started doing computer modeling of inkjet processes.
mm.
Xerox, when they hired me, was just starting to develop their first inkjet printers, and so they
Wow.
needed people to understand how do the drops get ejected, how do the heaters work to boil a little drop of water to force a bubble of ink out of the nozzle, how do the electronics work. So I was doing a lot of computer modeling to
Mm.
understand how inkjet printers work so we could actually design one.
Xerox is very interesting organization, Pete, because today many people, majority of people still call copier as Xerox, whichever brand it may be, right?
Yeah, yes. And that's a big point of contention with Xerox because if people, instead of saying, I want to make a photocopy of this piece of paper, if they say,
Yeah,
oh, go and Xerox it,
yeah, yeah.
then they lose their branding, as you said.
Exactly. I'm so proud to have you on my show because I got a person from Xerox.
When I
And
started working with the company, it was a fine company. They really did some excellent work.
mm,
They're kind of a shadow of what they were years ago. But back then, they were really in their heyday doing some fun stuff and making great innovations.
you were the only disabled person working with Xerox at that time?
So, certainly in research, I was the only blind person. I maybe knew one other person who worked in one of the business offices who was blind, but there were very
Administration
few
mostly.
people. And that's pretty common, I would guess, right? I mean,
Yes,
how many
yes, yes.
blind people are in one particular city or locale, let alone one company?
I
Well,
never met a blind scientist in my entire lifetime.
well, and if I think of most of the people I interact with who are blind professionals these days,
Mm,
most of them I met over the internet in one way or another.
mm,
So the internet has been a great tool for people to connect, share their stories, share their experiences
yeah.
and expertise.
And I'm pretty sure very, very, very few blind people will take up physics, right?
I think that's true.
Yeah.
And part of that is, as you say, some things are a little bit harder without sight, although these days, with the technologies that are available, it is certainly possible to do these things.
Yeah.
But I think when they when you look at the people around them, people are kind of discouraging
Mm,
about doing something like that. First of all, many people are intimidated about mathematics and science to begin with.
Mm,
But besides that, they just think, oh, a blind person can't do that. If
right.
I think of many of the rehab agencies in this country, they're more likely to advise young students to go into social work
Yeah.
or, some softer type field like that. I mean, not
Yes.
that I don't want to be pejorative about social workers because we certainly need them, but they come from social work backgrounds, the people who are working in these fields. What do they know best? That's what they're going to encourage people to do. They're not
Mm,
going to say, hey, you can have a great career as a scientist or a lawyer or, something that requires some specialty
yeah.
like that.
Peter, you are a musician. Not just that, you are a singer, you are a composer. So I know you as a singer, I know you as a composer, I know you as a musician. I want my listeners to know today, like, how did you get interested into this?
So that's pretty interesting. My interest in music goes way back. As I mentioned, when I was young, because they didn't mainstream blind people back then, I actually went to a school for the blind until I was in fifth grade, at
Mm,
which time I switched to regular public schools. But in the school for the blind, they had a blind piano teacher
mm,
and they offered to give you free piano lessons. So I actually started taking piano lessons in second grade, being taught by a blind piano teacher.
mm, mm,
And then I was always interested in music. I was pretty good at it. And in high school, I wound up going to a all-day Saturday program at the Manhattan School of Music in New York City,
mm,
where people who were generally more interested in going to college in music or having a professional career would go to. And they would teach you music theory and composition and piano lessons and chorus. And it was a pretty intense program.
mm,
And so
mm.
I learned a lot of my background in music from going to that school. It turns out that they wanted me to work so hard. They wanted me to practice a couple of hours a day. And I just wasn't that much into music. And I finally just quit cold turkey. And I never played the piano again until I just about finished graduate school.
Mm,
The other thing that was interesting at the time, when you're learning music at that level, they want to teach you classical music. Well,
yeah.
although I could read the music, I had to look so close at the music that I couldn't play and read at the same time. So I essentially had to memorize all my music. And by
Mm,
time you learn some of these classical piano pieces, I was sick of it. But
mm,
you can't start making music out of it really until you memorized it.
yeah.
So it just really wasn't a fun experience. Later on in graduate school, I had a friend who introduced me to jazz, and I really got into that because with the background I had in music composition and structure,
Mm,
I found that if I knew the melody to a tune, I could easily put together some harmonies and arrangements on the piano, different chord progressions,
mm, mm.
and I found that a lot more enjoyable.
Interesting. Have you ever got into any music recordings and stuff like that professionally?
So what happened? Music for me was mostly a fun experience. I mostly did it for myself.
All right.
After I retired from Xerox, I was playing for fun with some retired colleagues every couple of weeks or so. And one day, one of them looked up and said, boy, this sounds good. We should play out.
Mm,
And we started a band with me playing piano and then my other friends playing guitar and bass. And we put together a little jazz trio and we'd play around town, mostly at senior facilities. And we'd
mm,
play maybe 15, 20 times a year. We didn't want to make it a job, it was just for fun. And we were playing jazz standards from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that was exactly what these people at the senior facilities wanted to hear.
yeah.
So it was really a lot of fun. And for me, the biggest thing about playing at those places was, first of all, it was nice to see people perk up and be happy and enjoy the music.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
second of all, having performances that were scheduled meant it gave you an excuse to focus on learning new tunes, making nice arrangements of your tunes and just making them more crisp.
mm.
You know, if you had a target and a goal like that, it just seemed to engender making better music. And we did that for nearly 10 years. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Pete, you have seen the music making that those old good golden days, and you are experiencing music making now today. So there is a lot of transformation between these two generations, right? So I want to know the differences you observed personally.
The differences in music over the years, you mean?
Music making back then and today.
Oh, so that's interesting. Originally, when I started learning jazz tunes, I would listen to them and try to put them together in my head.
Hmm.
And then later on, when I wanted to learn specific tunes, what Nancy used to do, I had what they call fake books, which in jazz, a fake book is a sheet of music that writes out the melody and then the chord names above it. So it's up to you to put together the kind of inversions and harmonizations of the chords. And it's really just a sketch of the harmonies
Hmm.
with the
Hmm.
melody written down. And so Nancy would take a little cassette recorder and plunk out the melody.
Hmm.
And then she would speak the chord names. And that's how I learned a lot of my jazz tunes initially.
Hmm.
Later on, I started using some more electronic methods that, as access technology improved, that was more available to me. And I learned a lot of my tunes using the Band in a Box program. So for people who aren't familiar with Band in a Box, basically it's a program where you can import tunes into it, a melody, type in chords, and it will play a full arrangement of whatever tune in whatever style you choose. So using Band in a Box, I could arrow through the song, read the chords that way, have JAWS speak them back to me, my screen reader,
Hmm.
and then uh, play the melody one note at a time or listen to it or play along with it. So it's a very useful way to learn these jazz tunes.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then eventually, when I had my trio and we'd want to play some of my own compositions, I would put my own compositions into Band in a Box
Hmm.
and then print out lead sheets from Band in a Box to share with the other musicians. So they had cited copies of the songs they could play along with.
Today, see, now the music has been evolved, right? So how is the pleasure of making music now in this generation?
Well, what's interesting is I've always been a piano player, and that's how I've put together my tunes, and I would share them with the trio, and we'd have a piano, guitar, and bass arrangement of it.
Hmm.
But since moving to Colorado, I tried to start some trios here, but for a number of reasons, it didn't work out. So
Hmm.
I'm mostly playing myself, and I don't mind playing independently. But I found the Reaper program to be very useful to learn to put together my own arrangements of tunes.
You
So
don't
using
need
a
to depend on
program,
anyone's help, right?
right? Yeah. So using a program like Reaper, I can play the piano part.
Hmm.
And then if I want a bass part, I can put in another instrument on another track and use my MIDI keyboard to put in a bass part. Or if
Hmm.
I want to put in a trumpet part. And so it's been interesting to learn how to arrange music in a very different way and use different kinds of instruments.
Hmm.
So Reaper's been a real enabler to do that.
Now
It's been a
music
lot of
is
fun.
more accessible. That is what you think, right?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I think technology has improved access in many areas of the lives of blind people, right? I mean, if I think of the early speech synthesizers, you could barely understand them. I
Hmm.
mean, these days, everything talks. My phone talks, my PC talks. We have a talking scale
Yeah.
in our house.
Now, tell me, how did the idea come into your brain of starting a podcast like Eyes on Success?
So that was another interesting story. As retirees, we were always looking for new things to get involved in, new volunteer activities. When we first retired, we started working on Habitat for Humanity, building houses for people who couldn't afford them and things like that.
Hmm.
And one of the other things we volunteered for, our public radio station was having their semi-annual fund drive, and they wanted volunteers to come in and answer the phones and enter people's monetary pledges into a computer. And
mm,
so we figured we'd volunteer to do that. We took down Nancy's laptop because it had JAWS on it so I could use her computer.
mm.
And we sat there and I answered the phones and did my thing. People would come in. Wow, how's the blind person answering the phones and
Oh.
entering the pledges?
Huh.
And one of the people who came in to see this was the manager of the FM station, who
Mm,
also happened to run the radio reading service.
mm,
And she thought this was great. She actually had a blind person running the boards for the radio reading service.
mm,
And she was concerned that this person, his software um, wasn't compatible
mm.
with the software that the entire station wanted to upgrade to.
Okay.
And so the entire station, AM, FM, radio reading services, they didn't update to the next version of their software because this guy's software wouldn't handle it.
Mm,
And so
mm,
she asked me, she said, well, it looks like you're pretty knowledgeable about computers. Can you help him out? And
mm,
I wound up writing some JAWS scripts that enabled him to work with the new software.
mm.
And the day I handed it to him, the whole station upgraded to the new software. So that was kind of neat. Anyway, as part of the radio reading service, she asked Nancy to read for the
Mm,
radio reading service if she wanted to be a volunteer. So Nancy was reading newspaper articles and things like that. And then after Nancy was doing that for a while, she said, you know, you guys both speak well. Pete knows a lot about access technology for the blind. Why don't you guys do a podcast for it? And so we used to come in once a week and just chat about different access things. After a while, we figured, we could really do this ourselves and host our own podcast because the radio reading service, they weren't all that organized. Their podcasts weren't always being posted. So
mm,
I started posting them on our own website. They got a little annoyed at that. And I said, well, look, if you don't want me to do it, I don't need to come in. I'll do it myself. It's quite possible to do podcasts from home these days.
mm, mm.
So we've been doing that now for the past 13 years. We've been doing that now for the past 13 years.
Oh,
Every week, we have nearly 700 episodes in our archive.
yeah.
Because we have so many episodes,
Mm,
I
mm,
figured if people want to look for a particular topic, they shouldn't have to look through 700 things. I wrote a little search function. So if you put in a topic like reading or navigation or mobility or skiing, it'll come up with just the shows that match that topic to make it easy to find.
Almost all you have covered everything in the podcast.
Virtually. And if we haven't, people contact us and say, have you done a show on so and so? And we'll reach out to someone who's involved in that field and we'll do an interview. So we like getting suggestions from our listeners and supporters.
You have interacted with whole lot of people related to blind community across the globe right now. After talking to so many people who are connected with the industry which deals with people with blindness, what did you finally understand about the community? What is your one word solution for solving all these problems related to accessibility?
Well, hard to put it in one word, but I think the reason we do this show is,
Hmm,
look, I had a career, a very successful and rewarding career as a blind scientist, and people wouldn't normally think you can do that. And so the point of the show and the reason we call it Eyes on Success
hmm,
is that you can be successful in many fields.
hmm,
You
hmm.
don't have to be out on the corner selling pencils if you're a blind person. You can do virtually anything.
Yeah.
And so we reach out to people in various fields that you might not think a blind person can partake in.
Hmm,
And we interview people and say, how did you do it? So the idea of the show is to illustrate to people around the world that
hmm.
you can do these things. And sometimes you just need to know that it's possible in order to pursue those goals. So we've interviewed lawyers, scientists, people who do cross country skiing, play hockey, play
Mm.
cricket, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And really, a lot of it, I think, is knowing about the resources that are available, knowing that anything is possible if you put your mind to it. You may have to do things in a slightly different way. I mean, as I did, being a physicist, right? I wanted to be an experimental physicist, and yeah, I could have done it. It would have been harder work and take longer, but I was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun being a physicist as a programmer and doing numerical calculations. And oh, by the way,
Mm.
I worked right across the hall from a bunch of experimentalists. When I wanted an experiment done, I went across the hall and talked to those guys, and we worked it out.
Mm. How about the government legislation in America? Because I would like to tell you that we people, we blind people in India, we always complain, we always come up with lots of complaints with our government regarding accessibility and welfare, stuff like that. I want to understand the situation in America for the people with disabilities. It might be any kind of disabilities for that matter, Pete.
Yeah. Well, to me, that's very distressing and a little bit depressing. We interview people, as you know, for the show all around the world, India, Vietnam, Malaysia. We've had people from all over.
Hmm.
And in many of these countries, they tell the same story that you tell. There isn't a lot of support from the government. And I think people's minds have not opened up as much as they have in the US to the fact that disabled people can and should be full participants in society. I
Hmm.
think partially in the US, what helped change those attitudes was the Americans with Disability Act, which said that, disabled people, they have these rights and they are required to have access to public facilities and the internet and things like that. And that's made a big difference. Now, I went through my career a little bit before that, and I consider myself fortunate to have worked for Xerox,
Hmm.
which was, at the time and still is, a very progressive company with a lot of money. So it was easy to support
Hmm.
any needs that I had. So, for example, it was kind of
Hmm.
funny. The day I showed up at work, they knew I was partially sighted and used a closed circuit TV system. The
Hmm.
day I showed up in my office, they had a TV system
Hmm.
that made large print. Now, they never asked me what closed circuit TV system I wanted or what system I wanted to use. They
Hmm.
just said, Pete needs this. It must have cost them $4,000 at the time. Turns
Yeah.
out it was a color TV, and I didn't want my face being that close to a color TV when they were still CRTs as opposed to LEDs. And so I said, I appreciate this, but this is no good. So they
Hmm.
said, well, just tell us what you want. And I did, and they bought me a TV, a CCTV from one of the low vision places.
Hmm.
But anytime I needed a braille display, you want another braille display? Fine, whatever makes your job easier. There was
Hmm.
never any problem. So I was lucky to work for Xerox, but also the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act in this country made a big difference. Fortunately, a
S-
lot of companies these days, I think, are thinking about accessibility in general from the ground up. I mean, no one had to force Windows to make the narrator screen reader available. No one had to force Apple to put voiceover in there. They're just being more sensitive to all these accessibility needs these days. And that's a good trend. But I think, as you pointed out, in a lot of these countries outside the US, it
hmm.
would really be helpful if the government had some laws and regulations that would more strongly encourage employees and agencies to be supportive of people with disabilities.
How about the financial support from the government for those disabled who are not on job yet?
So I don't know a lot about that, but I think there are a lot of, we have interviewed people from vocational rehab
Hmm.
agencies, and often they try to support blind individuals with programs that will help them acquire the skills to get jobs.
Hmm.
They won't actually get them jobs, but there are a number of these rehabilitation agencies that connect with private firms to get people training for certain jobs. And we've actually interviewed some of those. I can't remember the names right now, but if you
No,
type
no problem. No
employment into
problem.
our search field, it they'll it'll come up with shows where we talk with some of the companies that do offer training, generally paid for by the vocational rehabilitation agencies of some state in the
Yeah.
country.
Basically, when we look at software companies, when we look at hardware companies, I feel that they look at blind person as a very rich person, because what I feel is we pay the same amount what our other person, a normal sighted person pays, but in fact we use only 50% of their resources.
Yes.
For now, all countries individually operate their autonomous forums for people with disabilities. But what I feel is accessibility is a global problem. And I strongly feel that there should be one or two global forums for people with disability where we can raise a voice more loudly. What is your opinion on that, Pete?
Well, that would be nice, but as you know, we take this earth of ours, which is one big, environmental place, and we draw these imaginary lines defining countries and boundaries
Mm,
between geographic locations. And somehow defining those lines makes it hard for those places to interact. So
mm,
different countries have their own rules. They don't want to live by the other country's rules. And even within a country, different states and regions, everybody wants their own independence. And it's hard on a global scale for people to be integrated. I mean,
mm.
fortunately there's some organizations that try to overcome that. For example, you look at Bookshare. When Bookshare first came out, it was only available in the United States
Yes.
because we had modified our copyright rules to make books accessible to people with disabilities.
Yeah.
And Bookshare was very proactive in advocating for things like the Marrakesh Treaty, interacting with other countries. And now these books are available in most of the world, not totally yet. So there are some organizations that do cross the boundaries between countries and regions, and that's good to see. But it's still a struggle, right?
Pete, it was great talking to you. And now we have come to a stage where I have this question for all my guests coming on Human versus Human. And you will definitely have no option to say no, you have to answer this. Are you ready to take up the question?
I assume you'll come up with a good question.
Of course. Okay, Pete, now I am giving you superpowers in your hands to change something in this world. So, what that one thing is going to be?
Wow. You know, Based on what we were talking about, I think it'd be really kind of cool to wipe out all these imaginary boundaries between countries and regions and start treating the world as one place where humans live and respect the differences between people who live differently in different cultures and societies. And, if we can intermingle a little bit more, respect each other a little bit more, that would be a good thing.
Wonderful.
That's what I'd
And
like to see, a more homogeneous world with fewer boundaries.
I was saying about your recent song. I heard one of your Christmas songs recently that defines the same philosophy, right? Cross borders and cross cultures. Awesome.
Oh, that was exactly. Yeah, they put together every year the Reapers Without Peepers Christmas album. And, I respect that attitude. A lot of people, you know, celebrate Christmas and what Christmas entails. And I thought, well, but there are lots of other people around the world who celebrate other things that are
Yeah.
just as important. And that was why I put together that song to sort of open up people's minds to the fact that, just because some group of people celebrate this one thing, we have to respect what other people celebrate also. And I was hoping that tune would open up people's minds to that attitude. So I'm glad you caught that.
Pete, if you do not mind, shall I play this song for my
Go ahead.
listeners?
Sure.
In the heart of winter, a magical time when snowflakes glisten and church bells chime. We gather round the fire, our loved ones near. But let's remember something important this year. Christmas is special, that's surely true. But other holidays are celebrated too, around the world in many different ways. Let's honor them all in these festive days.
That was a lovely song, Pete. Thanks for this song. And listeners, I hope you enjoyed the song too, along with me. And Pete, it was really wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for giving me this great opportunity to host you on Suman vs. Human.
Yeah, you too. It was great talking with you, Suman. I've really come to enjoy your posts on Reaper, and it was really great to talk with you in person.
With candles aglow and Canara on display, a celebration of culture in a unique way. Christmas is special, that's surely true. But other holidays are celebrated too, around the world in many different ways. Let's honor them all in these festive days. Diwali, a festival of lights so grand, in India and beyond across the land. The triumph of good over darkness it stands, with lamps and sweets it unites all hands. Yule and solstice for some are divine, as nature's cycles they truly define. The rebirth of the sun and the promise of spring, in ancient traditions their praises we sing. Christmas is special, that's surely true. But other holidays are celebrated too, around the world in many different ways. Let's honor them all in these festive days. Bodhi Day brings enlightenment's grace, for Buddhists a time to seek their own space. With meditation and wisdom they find their own path. In this tapestry of faiths we all have a chance. Noel and New Year for some they hold dear, with fireworks and festivals to ring in the year. A time to reflect, set new goals and aspire. In cultures worldwide they light up the fire. Christmas is special, that's surely true. But other holidays are celebrated too, around the world in many different ways. Let's honor them all in these festive days. So let's come together in peace and in cheer. With open hearts, let's make it clear that while Christmas is cherished, let love light our way to honor all holidays every day. To honor all holidays every day.